building housed the Royal Bethlehem Hospital, otherwise known as the notorious Bedlam. And it was on various locations. It started off around the sort of border of the city on the east, around Liverpool Street. I think there were 2 or 3 locations there. Then it moved over the river to this very handsome building you see now. So this story starts before the move, because it came here in 1930. Sorry, no, the Imperial War Museum took the building on in 1930. Before that, it was the hospital. So the hospital moved off to leafier climes in Beckenham, and the building was free, and the museum moved in. So we're going back now to when the museum was actually on the site of Liverpool Station. And this is the end of the 18th century. So this story is about a young woman and a faithless lover, so it's very gothic. During the Second World War, barrage balloons were stationed in the grounds of the Imperial War Museum, because it's quite close to the Thames, so it makes sense. And the soldiers that were manning these balloons at night heard, they claimed, clanking of chains and howling, which, is pretty impressive for a ghost. And it's thought that this is the ghost of Rebecca. So the story goes that around 1780, Rebecca was a servant in a grand house. Now, there's 2 slightly different versions of the story. Some say that either she was in love with her master, who then decided to move out of London and she lost her job, she lost her home, she lost her love. The other story is that she was having a secret affair with the son of the grand house, who had promised to marry her, and then got engaged to a young woman more appropriate to his station, leaving her, brokenhearted and probably pregnant. What we do know is that when this happened, Rebecca was gifted a golden guinea by her faithless lover. Whether that was compensation, whether it was a token of affection, we don't know. But the whole shock and the trauma of the incident and this sudden feeling of kind of completely having the rug pulled from beyond your feet caused Rebecca to have what we would call in modern terms a breakdown. And she was admitted to Bedlam at Liverpool Street. She hung on to that golden guinea until she died. I mean, when you think about the comfort she could have bought in hospital, but no, she hung on to it, and her determination was to be buried with it. So eventually Rebecca did die. And as she was being prepared to be buried, one of the attendants prized that guinea out of her dead hand and took it. Rebecca did not take this lying down. She was seen in the hospital from time to time, screaming at patients and staff, "Give me back my guinea!" And when the hospital moved to Lambeth, she suddenly got a guinea back. The ghost moved as well. And she was still seen in the grounds of the hospital, in the hospital itself, "Give me back my guinea." The hospital, as I said, moved to Beckenham, where they have a beautiful little museum of the mind. If you ever have time, go, it's gorgeous. And we think that the ghost stayed put. I did ask some of the attendants when I last visited the Imperial War Museum if there were any strange goings on. Museums are really reluctant to have those conversations. And the woman I spoke to said, yeah, maybe, but she was a bit coy about it all, to be honest. So we never really got to the bottom of that one. But that's our first moving ghost. So went to Liverpool Street to Lambeth and decided to stay in South London. Next slide, please. Thank you. You won't get this story in a book. As far as I'm aware, I'm the only person that knows this story, and I'm dead pleased with myself. If anybody heard me chatting to CJ before we started the meeting properly, you'll know that I'm a careers advisor by profession. And probably about 11, 12 years ago now, was temping at this place, which is Southwark College in Waterloo. It didn't look as posh then, they've had a rebuild. But I was speaking to students that wanted to join and go on courses. And this chap came in, he's about the same age as me, very friendly, pleasant bloke, sat down, had a bit of a natter. He said, do you know what? He said, when this building was built, my granddad worked on it. And I was like, okay, you know, that's interesting. He said, yeah, and there's a Roman villa under it. So like folklorist ears go up. Like, what? He said, yeah, when they dug the foundations for this building, they found a mosaic floor underneath the college. And the foreman said, oh, we can't have that, it'll hold up work and we won't get paid. So just smash it up and bury it. Now, I've never come across that story anywhere else. So he either made it up or it's true. I'll leave that one to you, but it's certainly not a story that I've ever heard from anyone else about this site. And this part of London has loads of Roman stuff. There's a Roman boat buried under Guy's Hospital, which is, you know, walking distance of this building. But the Roman villa remains a mystery. Is it a story, or did his granddad really see it? Next slide, please. This is real. So Southwark, the South Works, is probably almost as old, if not as old, as the City of London. It's one of the oldest bits of the city as a whole, not the City of London. And when the Romans came, they brought a lot of stuff with them. They brought rabbits and chickens, for which I thank them, but they also brought religion. And this flask was unearthed in Tooley Street, which is in SE1, so it's not a terribly long way away from the river, and we'll talk a lot about that part of the borough in a minute. And the inscription on this says, I'm going to look at my notes here, Londinae ad Banum Isidis, to London at the temple of Isis. And this strongly suggests that at some point there was a temple to Isis somewhere in that area. It's likely that her worship came with the Romans because they were real religious magpies. They'd pick up gods and goddesses. Quite often they'd equate them to their own. So, for example, the Sulis Minerva at Bath is a mashup of the local Celtic goddess and one they stole off somebody else. So it's not surprising that they brought Isis over. It's nice that they buried something that we could see. Also, when I was researching this talk, I found that an excavation of a cremation burial in nearby Great Dover Street, which is very close, revealed some small ceramic, they cut lamps in the shape of the god Anubis's head. So there's a real kind of Rome, Egypt, Southwark connection there. And yeah, interesting stuff. Moving on, and if we were walking, we'd be walking now down through the side streets and back to the river to Crossbones. Apologies, because some of you have probably even been there, but for those people who never have, I'm going to tell you a bit about it. So you can see there that there are tons of things tied to a fence, and that's our starting point. I'm going to take you back now, probably to the end of the 1990s, mid to late 1990s. A local writer and poet and shaman, John Constable, also known as John Crow, had a vision. It was late at night, the way he tells it. He was in his flat, which is just off Borough High Street, so about 10 minutes away from this side. And the spirit of a woman appeared to him and said, you know, follow, basically. And he did. And she led him to Red Cross Way. And Red Cross Way is actually a building site. It certainly was at that point. We're quite near London Bridge Station here. There was a massive redevelopment of the station over the last few years. They built extra platforms. Quite a lot of the local area was under threat to be demolished. And Red Cross Way already had porter cabins and God knows what. They were ready to go, really. And John really didn't know a lot about the history of the place. But the woman said to him, I'm a Winchester goose. Now, the Winchester geese, he found out later, were the names of the prostitutes that worked around Bankside. At that point, much of Bankside, where the sort of South Bank Arts Complex is, going up past the Globe Theatre, was very much kind of Disneyland for well-off middle-class London gentlemen. So you would get the ferry boat over from the West End. You'd have your drinking and your bear baiting and your cockfighting and your whoring, somewhere where the wife and servants wouldn't notice. Then you get back on the boat again. And these women were licensed by the Bishop of Winchester because he owned something called the Liberty of the Clink, which was a small part of the South Bank that he had the right to make the laws over. So he could decide what happens and what doesn't. And he licensed brothels there. And the women that worked there, the sex workers, were known as the Winchester geese. And the story goes that that's because they had, a lot of them had very serious respiratory illnesses, along with heaven knows what else they caught. And they had a hacking cough that kind of sounded like a goose honking. So that's why they were called the geese. But John didn't know any of this. And this spirit revealed it all to him. And he thought, well, we can't let Crossbones be like this. And first of all, what's there? And it turned out that this particular bit of Red Cross Way had originally been a post-medieval graveyard for paupers. So it wasn't consecrated, and upwards of at least 15,000 bodies have been buried there over the years. It was closed, I believe, in the 19th century because it was so absolutely full that they couldn't get anyone else in there. And it was probably one of those cemeteries that contributed to the big garden cemetery boom in London because, you know, it was actually unhealthy. Sorry, going back to the notes here because I've gone off on a tangent. There's been some debate, though, about whether this graveyard was where the Winchester geese were buried. We know that a lot of local paupers were buried there, but enough for the story that John's vision led him here. And over the years, a group formed called the Friends of Crossbones, and they were able to convince the railway engineering people to keep part of the site as a memorial garden to the people that had been buried there. And as part of that, every month there's a ritual. People come on the 23rd of the month, they sing songs, they commemorate the dead, and they decorate the fence here. And many, many years ago now, I was doing a thing with this guy who's a musician, and he gave everybody a stone at the end of the ritual and said, keep it and do something special with it. And I forgot about it. And I was walking past Crossbones one day, and people leave little things, they leave ribbons, they leave toys, they leave little bits of cheap jewelry. And I found the stone in the bottom of my bag. So my stone's there now. It's such a strange place because you're just surrounded by, like, you can see, you know, hoardings and stuff. And then there's this very spiritual, tiny centre. Could I have the next slide, please? John did something with this. He's a playwright and poet, and he wrote a play called The Southwark Mysteries, which was, it's been shown at the Globe, it's been presented at Southwark Cathedral, and this photograph shows one of the presentations at Southwark. It's caused a bit of a ruckus. Certainly the first time around, they had quite a trendy bishop. A lot of people felt there shouldn't be a play about prostitutes in the cathedral. The bishop was like, hey, you know, we are all God's children. And the church have actually made an apology for not letting those women be buried in consecrated ground. So that's just quite a nice ending to the story, I think. Moving on. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to take you now back onto Borough High Street, which isn't very far from the cathedral. The cathedral is at one end of it. Talk about a few local ghosts, because everybody likes a ghost story. So the pub on the left is the Market Porter. Absolutely packed in the evening. Usually there's people out on the pavement. It's really nice little boozer. And it had a bit of a narrow escape because a few years ago, the plan was to bulldoze and relocate Borough Market, which it's next to, and move everything to allow for this railway thing that's just caused chaos. But luckily it was saved, and that's good because it's a good old pub. So the pub used to be called the Harrow up until 1890, and it changed its name to the Market Porter because of a murder that took place on the site. So the story is that a chap called Lamb was drinking in the Harrow after work. He was a market porter. So he'd finished his work for the day, gone in there for a pint, and a mate of his, Alfie Howe, known as Flash Alf, turned up. Now, Alfie was a bit of a habitual drunkard and a bit of a nuisance, quite honestly. I mean, he's a nice enough bloke, but, you know. And Alfie tried to pick a fight with him. He had one too many. He was like a bit of that. Lamb picked his umbrella up and poked the pin at the bottom, is that what it's called? Right into this guy's eye, went straight into his brain, killed him instantly. It's a wonder he didn't hang for that, but another friend of his who was there, a carpenter, testified that he had been provoked and he'd done it in self-defense, although Lamb did say that Alfie had been asking for it for ages. So, but since the murder, there's been some strange goings on in the pub. Story goes that if you go past there after closing time and all the staff have locked up and gone away, you can see shadowy figures through the window sitting at the bar and actually hear people chatting. So it's like Alfie and Mr. Lamb have come back for one last pint. If we come back onto Borough High Street now to the George, which is the pub on the right there, a lot of the George has been demolished. It used to be a lot bigger, but it's a traditional coaching inn and has been there since at least the 16th century. Coaching inns were often used for live theatre because the galleries were so good. I'm not sure whether they did the play in the gallery or whether you sat on the courtyard and watched it in the gallery or what. But there's a strong possibility that Shakespeare drank here and he or performed here. Charles Dickens certainly drank here. It's not one of the famous literary figures I'm going to talk about today, though. It's the ex-pub landlady. And she's been around for a while, and she really shouldn't be because she's dead. But she's making a bit of a nuisance of herself. She hates new technology. So there's been some very strange shadowy figures seen on the pub CCTV. Drawers jam in electronic tills, lights go on and off. Basically, computers that are used for managing the business suddenly just go on the fritz. She just doesn't like technology. She doesn't want it in her pub. She's a kind of 1920s Peggy Mitchell. And this is her thing. Again, mentioned it to one of the bar staff, but I didn't want to talk about it. But it's a nice pub. I'm going to take you sort of a bit round the corner now, back towards the river. I said we were going round in circles to the Anchor Tap for a shaggy ghost story. So next slide, please. Right. I like animal ghosts. In fact, I love animal ghosts. Animal ghosts are my favourite. So the story is here, another murder. South East London was not a good place to be until very recently. It just seemed to have all the pirates and the ne'er-do-wells. And on this occasion, a chap and his dog were having a quiet drink in the Anchor Tap, which it's a real tourist trap now, and you can see it's very pretty. But in those days, it was a bit more rough and ready, and there were a lot of people in there that you wouldn't want to meet on a dark night. And a group of folks came in and started on this chap, roughed him up a bit. And his dog, bless him, went to his defence. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The man was killed by these ruffians, who also trapped the dog's tail in a door and then beat it to death. Horrible story. The master went on to his final resting place, but the dog stuck around. And apparently at night, the faithful hound still haunts the place, and you can hear it howling piteously for his master to come home. And on that bit of mawkishness, let's move on to the Ship. This is the last pub in this bit, at least. I think I'm going to tell us so many pubs as we go on. So the Ship, another Borough High Street pub at the corner of Borough Road. And this is another story about a serving girl. So it was not good to drink in pubs. It was not good to be in service because strange things happened. So this girl was called Mary, and she lived, we're not sure where, somewhere in London, probably somewhere in South London. And, you know, she was a housemaid, she worked hard. And one day she was out in the garden of the house where she lived. And she had a hard day, she fell asleep. She woke up, felt okay, and then a few days later she had an incredibly bad stomachache. What is this? You know, this is dangerous. But it eased when she started to vomit dozens of baby snakes. And she realised that what had happened was while she was asleep in the garden, probably snoring away, a snake had crawled into her mouth, down into her belly, and laid all its eggs. I'm asking you to believe this. It's a story, it's folklore. Either way, believe it or believe it not, she was exhibited at the ship as the girl who vomited snakes, and probably got a few more bob for that than she did for doing the dusting and the ironing in her mistress's house. So that's Mary. Next one, please. From the ridiculous to the sublime, perhaps, with an account of strange religions. I like them as well. Yeah, it might have been tapeworms, actually. This is Mary Girling. And Mary Girling started off life in Suffolk. In her 30s, she was living in Ipswich, married with children, had quite a normal working class lifestyle. And then in 1858, no, I'm wrong. Before that, in 1858, which was 11, do you know what? I'm misreading my notes. Rewind. Okay. In 1858, which was 31, she was visited by Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ popped up in her bedroom one day and brought her a revelation. He said, the second coming is at hand. Now, anybody with a bit of interest in religious movements know there's a lot of this going about in the 19th century. But Mary was convinced. She gathered a small group of followers, and they formed a sect that was known at the time as the Girlingists. And they went on about walking around Suffolk, spreading their apocalyptic message. At one point, the locals got fed up with it. So Mary decided in 1871 to bring the sect down to London in search of acceptance and some new recruits. So they ended up originally in Plumstead, which is sort of on the edge of southeast London, going out towards Kent. She fell in with a Wesleyan sect called the Peculiar People of Plumstead, which is just like the best name for religion ever. And they had very similar beliefs. They had this kind of apocalyptic hellfire style about them. And it was fine until Mary said, actually, I am a divine being. And they said no. So that was the end of that. So she then moved to the Elephant Castle and set up church in a railway arch in what is probably now Elephant Street, which sort of runs along the back of the railway station on the south side. They were there for a few years, and she was a charismatic, she was a real hellfire preacher, and that style of preaching really attracted some of the locals. And her congregation used to get really wound up, so they kind of jump around and shout, and this earned them the name the Walworth Jumpers. Excuse me. So the Walworth Jumpers were there for a few years. And then in 1873, Mary decided again to move the sect out of London, and they moved to the New Forest and were renamed the New Forest Shakers. I couldn't help it when I was putting this together. I was thinking of like girl groups, but she quit one band and now she's in another. She died in 1886 and the sect kind of fell apart. Although when I was talking about this with somebody, they said they had a feeling that there was something still connected in a housing estate somewhere near Camberwell. I wouldn't be surprised. But the whole area, actually, from the Elephant Castle up the Walworth Road, we're going to go up the Walworth Road in a minute. The Walworth Road is a big main road that runs from the Elephant Castle out roughly south. And we've got the big Baptist Metropolitan Tabernacle at the Elephant Castle end, and more little tiny evangelical churches than you can count. on the Walworth Road, in old shops, in old pubs, we've got a mosque in an old pub as well. So there's a lot of small religious communities even now on that road. Next slide, please. Austin Osman's Fair. Right, this is the bit, please don't ask me too many questions because I'm no expert, but I couldn't leave him out. He's an amazing artist. This is his self-portrait. He was originally born in north of the river, but lived for a lot of his life south of the river and for a considerable amount of time on the Walworth Road, in between all the evangelical churches, one imagines. So he was born in Snow Hill, which is pretty much next to Smithfield Meat Market, but the family moved to Lambeth when he was 7. He had an incredible talent for art, but he was from a working class family. His dad was a policeman, and he took work as an apprentice draftsman in his teens. But he took evening classes in art at the Lambeth Institute, eventually got himself to the Royal College of Art. He was incredibly praised there. He was a fine draftsman. He had very inventive use of colour. But he's more famous now for his occultism than he is for his art and painting. After he left the Royal College of Art, he exhibited at Kennington Library originally, which again was close to his home and not terribly far away from where he ended up living. But his magical interest brought him into contact with Aleister Crowley, and this is not the first time we are going. This is not the only time we are going to meet Mr. Crowley today. Crowley invited him to join his Argentum Astra, the religious organisation he formed after leaving the Order of the Golden Dawn. Spare never became a full member, but he was kind of associated with it, although he didn't have a lot of time for Crowley, to say the least. In his Book of Pleasure, which he wrote in 1914, he described Crowley and his crew as these magicians whose insincerity is their safety, are but the unemployed dandies of the brothels. So you kind of get the feeling he'd gone off Crowley a bit by then. He went on to formulate his own magical system through the use of sigils, which are effectively magical glyphs. And this was known as the Zoskia. It's actually became part of a foundation for chaos magic. A lot of chaos magicians looked to Spare for inspiration. And it also brought him his interest in theosophy. He'd been a long time interest in theosophy and Hindu religion as well. It was very much about transcending the material and sort of extending your consciousness. By World War I, Spare was living in Tabard Street, not an awful long way away from the Borough High Street that we were just talking about. Then by the time war broke out, he was living in the Walworth Road. And a friend who is rather older than me and from that area reckons his flat was above what is now McDonald's. It was Woolworths then. He continued with his magic. He was never a rich man. He made a few bob, apparently. He made a card game based on racing, and he used to sell that, and he made a few bob out of that. You can now find it on the internet very occasionally, and it ain't cheap. He also used to paint not just occult pictures, but also pictures of film stars that he took from magazines, pictures of locals. He'd sit in the pub and paint a portrait. But a lot of his pictures were very odd. A few years ago, the sadly now no longer with us, Cumy Museum put on an exhibition of his work, which was great. But some of the pictures they were able to source, the local council who owned the museum wouldn't let them show because they were too explicitly sexual. So a few of us grumped and said, well, why didn't they just put them behind a curtain then? But tough. So Spare was bombed out of his flat in the war and eventually moved back to Lambeth, to Stockwell. So he always stayed around South London. I mean, all of these places pretty much within walking distance of each other until he died of complications following a burst appendix in 1956. Right, we're going to go as if now we were going along the Walworth Road to Camberwell for another ghost story and another Aleister Crowley. lovely story. So you get 2 for the price of 1 here. This is St Giles's. Gorgeous old church. I've never actually been in, but the stained glass is incredible. You can't see very well. I tried hard to find a picture and couldn't. But to the right of the church, as you're looking at it from the screen, there's a little path, and that runs past a little bit of what's left of the churchyard, where the squirrels that mug you for fruit live. I know it's happened, to what used to be the clergy house behind. That's long gone now. And the story goes that sometimes if you walk down that path, you will see an elderly clergyman out taking the air. But it's no good talking to him because he's not the current vicar. He's a former rector who died many, many years ago, but occasionally comes back to have a look at the old place. The vicar here in 1880 up to 1915 was the Reverend Frederick Festus Kelly. And Kelly is probably best known for his daughter. He had a son called Gerald, who was at Cambridge with Alistair Crowley. They were undergraduates together, and according to the Transpontine website, could well have been lovers. But Crowley then met Gerald's younger sister, Rose. Now, her mother was trying to fix her up with somebody, and she was not liking that idea at all. So Crowley kind of married her to save her from that. They got married in 1903, but they did eventually become extremely fond of each other. And Rose went with Crowley to Egypt in 1904, where she channeled the spirit. Now, I never pronounced this right. It's Ivas, as he dictated the Book of the Law, which is one of Crowley's most famous works. So Rose actually channeled that, and Crowley wrote it down. The marriage was happy at first, but after the death of their first child from typhoid, the relationship deteriorated. Rose drank heavily. They did divorce. She remarried, but sadly died of alcohol-related illness in 1935. So that was Rose. But nice place to live as a kid, I think. Girls in Camberwell. Next one, please. So taking you to Peckham now for one of my favourites. So apologies, because I know at least some of you have heard this before. I love this story. So this block of flats used to be a pub called the King on the Rye. And the pub was built in the 60s on the site of an older building. The reason that the building wasn't there is that the pub got bombed in World War II. Cellar at that time, pub cellar, was being used as an air raid shelter, and the building took a direct hit. The bomb went through the building, down into the cellar, and detonated in the cellar. So nobody in there sheltering had a chance. And I think about 12 or 14 people died. 11 people were killed. So time went on, the site was cleared, the new pub was built, and later the same building was converted into these apartments. But at night, sometimes, particularly around New Year's Eve, you can hear people singing old musical songs around the piano. You can hear clanking glasses and stomping feet. So it may be that the party is still going on in the other realm. Also, a ghost of a young woman who is thought to have been one of the 11 has been seen in the building, moving around. I'm not sure which bit. Obviously, you can't go and have a poke around now because it's all private apartments. Next slide, please. From Peckham to Nunhead now for the second tale of a moving ghost. This is a story about a chap called William Brown. And William Brown he led quite a simple life. He was a clerk at Bank of England. Nothing particularly exciting about that, except William was 6'7". Now, back in the 18th century, that was big. That was very tall. And William was very anxious after his death that he didn't fall prey to body snatchers, because those things happened in the 18th and 19th centuries. So he hadn't been a well man, partly due to his height. He probably had some sort of genetic condition and died very young. And his friends petitioned the bank what a lot of people don't know is that part of the Bank of England is built on sacred ground because it was built on the site of the church that was next door and was demolished. So the garden, as it was then, a courtyard in the middle of the bank, was was sanctified, and there were some bodies already in there from when it had been a churchyard. So his friend said, look, you know, he's a sound bloke, he's petrified. Can we bury him in the Bank of England? Because can you think of anywhere safer? So yeah, they buried him in the Bank of England, and his ghost was said to be a shadowy figure in the cloisters around the this courtyard. You can see there his coffin, kind of half in and half out, which is, if you're a folklorist, that's interesting. There's a lot of stories where people are buried half in, half out. It's a church and it's to keep them away from the devil, but that's a story for another day. So his ghost was seen there. There are a couple of ghosts at the Bank of England, but only William will concern us today. And then in the 30s, the bank decided to redevelop that area, and they now have what they call a garden court. So it's still a courtyard, but it's a bit more landscaped. And all the bodies were dug up and relocated to Nunhead Cemetery, which is kind of where we come in, because Nunhead is sort of between Peckham and Lewisham-ish, vaguely. So it's in South London. And again, the story goes that the ghost moved with his body, probably wondering where the heck they'd moved him, probably hoping to goodness he hadn't been dug up and used for dissections, and has been supposedly seen in Nunhead Cemetery from time to time. So there's a nice picture of Nunhead Cemetery with some bluebells there to cheer up the story, because it's a bit of a sad story. Next slide, please. Bit of community folklore. You cannot get, in my view, much more folkloric than a football club, because they're a real community. They've got their own language, pretty much. They're very good at keeping out outsiders, and this is a great story. Plus, I live in the same street as their stadium, so I've got to put Dulwich Hamlet in there. One of the oldest football clubs, established in the 1880s. I don't know if anybody knows what the picture on the left is. The one on the right is obviously a football club. The one on the left is Tuscany, and this brings us to the story. In the late 1980s, the football club was slightly, effectively next door to where they are now. It's a big piece of land. And to raise money to redevelop the club, they sold that land to Sainsbury's to build a supermarket and kind of went to move next door. And a lot of people that lived in the area were opposed to that. We didn't live there then, our house hadn't been built then. But there was a lot of opposition. And one chap wrote a very angry letter as part of the consultation process to say that it would spoil the view terribly if they moved the football club, because when he looked out of his window, it was like looking out over Tuscany. Now, the football supporters loved this. I actually know who this is. I'm not going to say who it is, because in subsequent redevelopment projects, he and I have been on the same side sometimes, about things like do not demolish the woods with the hedgehogs in it. But they took this up and they thought it was great. So if you go to a map of the hamlets, they'll have a Tuscany regional flag, and their chant is, just put my glasses on. They wave the flag and they shout, Tuscany, Tuscany, we're the famous Dulwich Hamlet and we look like Tuscany. And I love that because it's something that's actually come up in the last 30 years and it is enshrined in the folklore of the club. And I imagine that most of the visiting fans think, what the hell are they on about? Another bit of just trivia, but it's great. This is the main stand. And as well as housing the actual stands so that you can watch a game, behind that there's like the bar and the loos and the cafe and all of that. So the little stand across the picture from this is known as the toilets opposite stand. That's its original name, that's its real name. Because obviously the toilets are opposite in the other stand. Just silly nonsense, but it's great. It's a good laugh there down the hamlets on a Saturday. Next slide, please. I might have to speed up a bit, actually. I'll see how I do. This is the Horniman. So we're actually leaving Southwark now, on the last leg of the tour, if you like. And we're going to the Horniman Museum. A fabulous place. It's in Lewisham, just kind of on the boundary, for 2 stories. So the museum came about because the tea importer, Frederick Horniman, collected a lot of stuff from all around the world, and he had it in his house. He let people come and look at it, and eventually got so much stuff he built a museum to put it in, and it was left to the people of Lewisham in perpetuity, and there it is. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. The woman on the right is his daughter Annie. She was an occultist. She was a member of the Golden Dawn, along with Crowley again. And this gentleman, Samuel MacGregor Mathers, seen in full Egyptian ritual regalia. There is tale that Annie had her own collection of esoteric literature, which has somehow gone missing, but was kept in the house. We do know that when he opened his house to the public, she moved out because she didn't like all the disruption, all the strangers. But she did get Mathers a job there for a while as a librarian. So we can say that there were 2 working magicians at the Horniman in the late 18th, early 19th century. The main reason she got him a job as a librarian there, and he was actually Frederick Horniman's own personal librarian, was to a certain extent she was fed up with him asking her for money, because obviously her father was a tea importer, he was a wealthy man. Mathers never had 2 pennies to rub together and relied on charisma and the goodwill of friends quite a lot. And I think at this point Annie said, I'm going to stop giving you money, I'm going to get you a job. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long. But he was there for a while, and rumour has it that while he was there, he tried to reanimate one of the museum's mummies, because if you've got the opportunity there after hours, why not? We do not know how successful that was, but we know he had a go. Next slide, please. Right, a rather nicer story now. Going out to the bandstand, the Horniman is in beautiful gardens. There's a children's zoo, and it's just really sweet. And there's a ghost story attached from the 1940s. Occasionally, you can hear the sound of music in the gardens after dark. I mean, they do use the bandstand, but there's nobody performing there. And it's said that if you can get there close enough, you can see a couple in 1940s clothing waltzing to the music. Nobody knows who they are, where they come from. Their clothing dates them to the earlier part of the 20th century. But that is all we know. And every so often they come out and have a nice dance. A nice story. On to the last stop in our walk of a sort. This is Dulwich College. Victorian, mock, goodness knows what, public school, and probably not that interesting, except for its foundation myth. So if we go back, thinking again about what I said about Bankside earlier with the stews and the bear pits and things, Master of the King's bears and games and general revelry in the 16th century, or the early 17th, was a chap called Edward Alleyn. He was also a very famous actor. So he was well in at court, he was a very wealthy man. And this would have been towards the end of the 16th century, because he died in 1626. And he purchased the manor of Dulwich, which actually has effect up till this day. There are certain bits of the area that you're not allowed to build on without permission from the trust that manages the estate. And he decided to set some of the land aside for charitable purposes. Created a school for poor boys, I think initially about 12 boys, called the College of God's Gift at Dulwich. And over the years it grew, and it's now a major public school. But the history books don't tell you why he did that. So he was James I, his master of the king's games of bears, bulls, and mastiff dogs. Got a few, Bob. He performed a lot around the Bankside at the Rose Theatre and the Globe. And he was on stage one evening doing Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there's a point in the play where Faustus is surrounded by demons. So the play was going along, the demons came on, and then Alain realised that there was one more demon than he'd seen in the backstage before the play started, and he was a little bit scared. I think that's probably the understatement. And he was convinced that it had come to get him and it was come to take him to hell. And he thought, I have got to mend my ways because I don't want to go to hell. So he took some of this fortune, he set up this school and did various other charitable good works, and hopefully managed to buy his way out of an eternity in hell. So I am going to leave you now back at Elliott College. Do feel free to wander in the grounds. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Paula. That was fantastic.